in your experience, Ben, how much of a project do you think an EPC is willing to expose dedicated to risk, right? They're spending a lot of money on labor and concrete and steel and yellow metal. So things like liquidated damages, things like performance guarantees, that's all just risk mitigation on their part. I mean, if you've got a big old contract that EPC is undertaking, in your experience, like how much of that contract would they actually really expose to the risk side of things? So they might look at it and say, well, if this all goes to hell, at least I'm covering my cost, right?
Yeah, I mean, typically in these contract structures for LSTK, you have fixed cap, oftentimes upwards of around 20%, right? So let's just take a $100 million project for easy math, they might have $20 million. Then you look at, okay, what's their profit margin? Are they putting 20 million of their profit? Are they putting all their profit at risk, or are they putting most of their profit at risk? And it can be a little bit tricky to define that as an owner because each EPC is a little bit different. The ones that are more competitive, they will typically put most of their fee and maybe a little bit more at risk, but aren't looking to, bleed tons of balance sheet cash beyond that risk profile. So typically you see a lot of those guarantees capped at 20. So on a fixed price, if they're trying to make 15%, maybe they'll take 20% risk. So you'd have a little bit of arbitrage there in some cases. So that's a little bit of how they look at that.
Yeah,
but so.
Do you find that bonds are typically mandated, and what is their value? How does bonding help a project?
Yeah, you typically see some portion of bonding being required by the finance community. It's pretty common. It's also not uncommon for an EPC to be prepared to have to bond a project. How much they have to bond is very much driven by the risk profile of the project, right? Doing an oil and gas facility that's been built 550 times, within a 200-mile radius is a lot different than a first of a kind gasification to biofuels project. So it's a little bit industry specific. In this particular case, I think most of the stuff we're talking about is some of the more emerging asset classes. And so you can typically expect to see a little bit on the higher end expectation from the private equity infra markets for protection. Now, we could have a long conversation around what that protection means in practice versus on paper, but that's a long dialogue.
Right. So a change order, the thing that everybody dreads, one of the scorecards for an amazing project is no change orders, right? Everybody from the developer to the contractor should celebrate that. But, at what point is the EPC in the right to ask for a change order, and the developer should theoretically grant that change order?
Yeah, so change orders are always a fun topic. I think the change orders are designed for exactly what they sound like. Change that is essentially typically scope driven, right? Now, this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is a lot of who did the front engineering design package. Did you pay the EPC for a validation period if they didn't do it? So they said, yes, we officially recognize and own the risk in this design because you paid us to go spend the time to do so. Did you do an open book conversion? So we're way more mature. We're at 60% design instead of the 30% mark. So there's a lot of variables there, but generally speaking, a couple good examples would be, we had to install, we didn't do the feed package, and, we have to install a bigger pump over here than we expect, or two pumps instead of one that we expected, because you guys decided that you wanted to increase the flow rate. You wanted to increase the amount of gallons coming out of this particular piece because your offtake changed. And a lot of times it's commercial changes that have driven scope changes in the design is where we see a lot of that. It could be things that are contractually defined, like subsurface conditions or any exclusions that are in there that may have occurred. It could be, force majeure is a good example, right? Major, like COVID was a great case study for, are things a change order because of COVID or are they not? And you typically have a force majeure clause that will define an act of God. And sometimes those really can result in change orders and or claims. And so, but typically it's scope related changes that were, driven by something that the owner needed or requested that's, materially different than what was originally defined, which is very common.
Yeah. So the other side of that is rework, right? So, we don't have a lot of specs that we use as an industry, but if I'm an owner and I have a strong project manager, I have a strong owner's engineer that's on the job site with me, and we look at some of the contractor's work and we say, that's junk, redo that. Um, how would that decision go where the EPC might say, this is good work, and the owner feeling like, you know what, I don't think so. I think you should redo it. Is that ever a problem?
Yeah, it's not as it does happen. I wouldn't say it's the more common issue that arises. EPCs are typically pretty good about recognizing good quality work, and they usually often use a lot of vendors and contractors that they've worked with in the past. And so they typically own those relationships where before you have to say that's crap work, they've hopefully already done that on your behalf, and they're beating up their own subcontractors, right? Because they have, keep in mind, the subcontracts to the EPC, which is how most EPCs function, have the same types of language that you have with your EPC, right? So they have their own, clawback clauses and performance, related requirements, and their own, language for change orders that are between them two, right? Versus your language with the EPC. And so they try to back as much as they possibly can with the risk you're asking the EPC take as the subcontractor takes. And so they usually use that as the mechanism to resolve the issues.
So as we wind down a little bit, I guess my closing question would be, how should one go about selecting an EPC? So let's say a project has gotten through 5% design, 10% design, it's mostly formed, and then it comes time to bring in the big guns. Is this mostly based on reputation, relationship, price, availability? How does that go?
Over the years, I've become a bigger and bigger fan of competitively bidding an EPC contract, especially over the last 5 years where pricing has become a big driving force behind economic viability, in large part post-COVID supply chains driving up a lot of costs of labor in particular, but also material. So I think it's you'd be amazed at how much certain EPCs can influence material bulk commodity costs over others. And I think that makes a huge driving force between the competitive pricing between a lot of the EPCs today is what kind of supply chains do they have access to and what kind of pricing can they get on bulk commodities. It's a huge influencer today. And then labor force, right? That's the other one. Labor rights have gone way up. So I look at, do you have command of your geographic footprint that we're asking you to build this in? If you're a person who traditionally builds with non-union workers in the Southeast, and now you're asking me to go to California in a union environment, I wouldn't go that direction, right? You want somebody who is either, if it's union or non-union, you need to know if they've got, relationships in that regard. Do they have the labor footprint and the subcontract footprint in the geography of which they're building it? Do they have familiarity and intimacy with generally the process design, right? You don't want someone to be the first time they've ever even seen a biofuels project if they've been building roads, bridges, and tollways most of their careers. And then the last one would be, do they have their what I'll call their A team? What we often see is you can get a great name brand EPC, but you can get their C team because they have most of their A team on a $4 billion project in Kuwait or somewhere else where they're making all their money. So make sure you understand who the team is you're getting. Make sure you really understand that they have that geographic footprint and the labor force needed in that region, and then make sure that you really understand their procurement viability and their access to the commodities and things that you're going to need that influence. Those are probably some of the key drivers I would lean on.
Cool, Ben. Well, this has been great. Thanks. Very informative. You're a wealth of knowledge and vast experience. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, appreciate it, Paul.